Most legends are born in palaces, under the gaze of cheering crowds and the blessing of priests. But this legend was born in the dirt, wrapped in the cold cloak of shame and whispered about as a curse. Before he was a king, before he was a conqueror, and before he was a god, he was a mistake. This is not just a story of war. It is a story of a boy whose heart was broken so thoroughly that he decided to break the world in return. The year is 1787. The place is the rolling hills of what we now call KwaZulu-Natal. At this time, the Zulu were not an empire. They were a tiny, fragmented clan of perhaps 1,500 people, nestled among dozens of other small tribes. Life was governed by the seasons, the cattle, and the strict laws of the Nguni people. One of those laws was absolute. You did not marry within your own clan. It was seen as incestuous, a spiritual stain. But Senzanga Kona, the young chief of the Zulu, was a man of passion. He met Nandi, a daughter of the neighboring Langeni tribe. Their attraction was immediate, reckless, and illegal. When word reached the Zulu elders that Nandi was pregnant, they didn't offer a blessing. They offered mockery. They sent a messenger back to the Langeni tribe with a cruel insult. They claimed Nandi wasn't pregnant with a child, but was suffering from a stomach ailment caused by a parasite, the Shaka beetle. But months later, the parasite let out its first cry. A boy was born. In a move of incredible defiance, Nandi named the boy Shaka, taking the very insult used against her and turning it into a badge of identity. Little did the Zulu elders know that parasite would one day grow large enough to swallow their entire world. The shame of Shaka's birth meant he had no home. He and his mother were driven out of the Zulu kraal and forced to return to Nandi's people, the Langeni. But there, things were even worse. To the Langeni, Shaka was the living proof of a scandal. He was the bastard prince who brought bad luck to the harvests. Imagine the psychological forge this created. Every day, young Shaka was reminded of his illegitimacy. He was bullied by the other boys. They mocked his features, they stole his food, and they beat him because there was no father to protect him. In many accounts, it is said they forced him to eat hot coals or teased him about the size of his manhood. But while they were breaking his spirit, they were inadvertently building a monster. Shaka didn't cry. He didn't plead. He watched. He learned that in a world without a father, without a tribe, and without a law to protect you, there is only one currency that matters: power. Raw, unadulterated strength. He developed an unbreakable bond with his mother, Nandi. She became his only sanctuary, his only reason to survive. He made a silent vow to her and to himself. One day, he would never be small again. One day, the people who spat on them would be forced to crawl in the dust at their feet. In 1802, a massive famine struck the region. The Langeni, barely tolerating Shaka and Nandi during the good times, finally cast them out into the wilderness to starve. They were refugees in a land that was becoming increasingly violent. They wandered for miles through leopard-infested bush and scorching heat until they found refuge with a third tribe, the Mthethwa. This was the turning point. This was where the bastard began his transformation into the soldier. In the Mthethwa kraals, Shaka was no longer just a boy. He was growing into a physical specimen that terrified his peers. He was reaching 6 feet tall, his body hardened by years of walking and hunger. He was a weapon waiting for a hand to wield it. And that hand belonged to King Dingiswayo, a man who was about to give Shaka the one thing he never had: a purpose. By 1810, the bastard of the Langeni was gone. In his place stood a soldier of the Mthethwa Empire, whose physical prowess was already becoming the stuff of legend. In the army of King Dingiswayo, Shaka didn't just find a home, he found a laboratory. He was no longer a victim of fate, he was becoming the master of it. But as he watched the way the great kings of Africa conducted their wars, he didn't feel admiration, he felt contempt. To Shaka, the warfare of his ancestors was a farce. It was a ritualized dance that lacked the one thing he craved: finality. He saw men standing 50 paces apart, throwing light, spindly spears called assagais. They would duck, they would weave, and they would shout. To Shaka, this wasn't a battle, it was a conversation. And Shaka was done talking. Shaka realized that if you want to win a war, you must change the physics of the fight. He walked into the hut of a master blacksmith and handed him a design that would change the course of African history. He told the smith to take the iron from several throwing spears and melt them down. He didn't want a projectile, he wanted a blade. The result was the Iklwa. It was a short, heavy-headed stabbing spear with a blade nearly a foot long and 2 inches wide. It was balanced perfectly for a single, underhanded thrust. But the innovation wasn't just in the iron, it was in the philosophy. Shaka's logic was cold and brilliant. If you throw your spear, you are unarmed. You have given your enemy a gift. But if you keep your spear in your hand, you control the space. The Iklwa forced the warrior to close the distance. It forced him to look his enemy in the eye, to feel his breath, and to end the fight in a single, surgical movement. Legend says the name Iklwa was chosen because of the sucking sound the blade made when it was pulled from a human chest. It was the sound of an old world dying and a new, more brutal one being born. But Shaka knew that a better weapon was useless if the man holding it was slow. In the early 1800s, warriors wore leather sandals. They were fine for walking, but in the heat of a charge, they were slippery. They tripped, they slowed the man down. In a move that would be considered psychopathic by any other commander, Shaka ordered his men to throw their sandals away. When they complained that the ground was too hot and the thorns too sharp, Shaka didn't argue. He led them to a patch of ground covered in ugweba, vicious, inch-long thorns. He forced his men to dance on them. He forced them to stamp their feet into the burning sand and the sharp rocks until their soles were as hard as cured cowhide. Those who flinched were killed on the spot. It was a brutal Darwinian selection. The result was a military force that could march 50 miles in a single day, barefoot, over terrain that would destroy a modern boot. They were the fastest infantry on the planet. By the time an enemy tribe saw the dust of Shaka's army on the horizon, it was already too late. The Zulu were not coming. They were already there. Perhaps Shaka's most modern innovation was one that history often overlooks: logistics. Shaka understood that a hungry soldier is a dead soldier. He created the Udiribi, a corps of young boys who served as the army's supply line. These boys carried the heavy gear, the cooking pots, and the extra shields. This allowed Shaka's frontline warriors, the Impi, to remain light, fresh, and focused entirely on the kill. He turned his army into a professional machine. They didn't have to hunt for food or forage as they went. Their food followed them. He also revolutionized the shield. He replaced the light, flimsy cowhide shields of past with massive head-to-toe barriers made from the thickest hide available. He taught his men to use the left edge of the shield to hook the enemy's shield and pull it aside, exposing the ribs for the Iklwa. It was a system, a cold, calculated system of interlocking parts. Shaka sat in his kraal, watching his new model army grow. He saw the way they moved, the way they looked at him with a mixture of terror and godlike adoration. He knew the Mthethwa were just the beginning. He was no longer the boy who was bullied for his birth. He was the architect of a new kind of humanity. The weapons were ready, the men were hardened, the tactics were perfected. All Shaka needed was a throne of his own. And in 1816, the heavens finally gave him his chance. His father, the man who had abandoned him, was dead. The bastard was coming home. In 1816, the air in the Zulu Valley changed. Senzanga Kona, the father who had cast Shaka into the wilderness, was dead. He had left behind a successor, a half-brother named Sigujana, but Shaka did not recognize the inheritance of men who had never bled on a battlefield. Backed by a regiment of King Dingiswayo's finest soldiers, Shaka marched toward the royal kraal. He did not come to negotiate. He did not come to plead. He came to collect a debt that had been accruing interest for 30 years. Sigujana was assassinated before the sun could set. Shaka took the throne not with a coronation, but with an execution. He summoned those who had bullied him as a child, those who had spat on his mother, Nandi, and those who had called him a beetle. He didn't just kill them. He impaled them on the very fences of the kraal where they had mocked him. In one single bloody afternoon, Shaka sent a message to the hills. The Zulu were no longer a clan, they were a kingdom, and their king was a man who had forgotten how to forgive. With the Zulu throne secured, Shaka began the total reorganization of the Nguni way of life. He divided his men into Amabutho, age-grade regiments. They lived in military barracks. They were forbidden from marrying until they had washed their spears in the blood of an enemy. But his greatest contribution to the art of war was a formation so effective it would eventually baffle the British Empire. He called it the Izimpondo Zankomo, the buffalo horns. To Shaka, a battle was not a skirmish, it was a trap. He visualized the army as a living animal. The chest, Isifuba. These were the veteran warriors, the strongest and most experienced. Their job was to hit the enemy head-on, engaging them in a brutal, grinding melee with their heavy shields and Iklwa spears. The horns, Izimpondo. These were the youngest, fastest warriors. While the enemy was occupied with the chest, the horns would sprint outward in wide arcs, flanking the enemy on both sides until they met in the rear, creating a complete circle of death. The loins, Umuva. These were the reserves. They sat behind the chest, often with their backs to the battle so they wouldn't get overexcited. They were only deployed to reinforce a weak point or to finish the slaughter. This wasn't just a formation. It was a psychological weapon. Imagine being an enemy warrior. You are fighting the strongest men you've ever seen in front of you, and suddenly you hear the war cries of thousands of men behind you. There is no retreat. There is only the closing of the circle. The first true test of the buffalo horns came in 1818 at the Battle of Goekli Hill. Shaka's rival, the powerful King Zwide of the Ndwandwe, sent an army of 12,000 men to crush the Zulu upstart. Shaka had fewer than 5,000. On paper, the Zulu were doomed. But Shaka didn't fight on paper. He fought with the terrain. He positioned his men on the summit of a steep hill, forcing the Ndwandwe to climb in the scorching heat. He did something unheard of. He kept a small portion of his army hidden in a depression behind the hill. As the Ndwandwe charged up the slope, exhausted and thirsty, Shaka waited until the very last second. He didn't let his men throw a single spear. He waited until he could see the sweat on his enemy's brows. Then, he released the chest. The Zulu warriors crashed down the hill with the force of an avalanche. As the Ndwandwe recoiled, the horns emerged from the tall grass on the flanks. The trap snapped shut. By the time the sun began to set, the valley was a graveyard. The Ndwandwe, the most feared power in the region, had been humiliated. Shaka had proved that a small, disciplined machine will always destroy a large, disorganized mob. Kiwakli Hill was the spark that lit a continental fire. Shaka began a campaign of total conquest that history calls the Mfikane, the crushing. It was a period of chaos that reshaped the map of Africa. Shaka's philosophy was simple. If you were not Zulu, you were a target. Tribes that had lived in the valleys for centuries were forced to choose, integrate into the Zulu machine or flee. This created a domino effect. Displaced tribes fled north into modern-day Zimbabwe, west into Botswana, and south into the Cape. They brought Shaka's tactics with them, conquering others in their path to survive. It is estimated that the Mfikane resulted in the death or displacement of nearly 2 million people. But within the heart of the Zulu kingdom, life was changing. Shaka was no longer a warlord. He was a revolutionary. He abolished the old tribal loyalties. You were no longer a member of a clan. You were a soldier of the king. He was creating a national identity forged in the heat of the forge and the blood of the battlefield. He had built the most powerful indigenous empire in southern Africa. But as the borders of his world expanded, a new shadow began to creep over the horizon. White men carrying fire sticks and sailing on floating houses had arrived at Port Natal. The king of the earth was about to meet the kings of the sea. By 1824, Shaka Zulu was the undisputed master of his world. He had unified the fragmented clans, perfected the art of the kill, and built a capital city at Bulawayo that housed thousands of warriors. But as the sun rose over Port Natal, the horizon revealed a sight that no Zulu had ever imagined. Great wooden houses with white wings were floating on the water. From these vessels stepped men with skin the color of peeled bananas, dressed in wool and metal, carrying long sticks that spat lightning and thunder. To any other king, this might have been an omen of terror, but Shaka was not like other kings. He was a scientist of power. When his scouts brought news of these sea strangers, he didn't order their execution. He ordered their presence. He wanted to see if these men were gods, or merely another tribe with better tools. He invited the British traders, led by Henry Francis Finn and Francis Farewell, to his royal kraal. It was a meeting of two different universes, one built on the ancient laws of the spear and the other on the rising tide of the Industrial Revolution. Shaka received the British with a display of psychological warfare. He staged a parade of his cattle, thousands of them sorted by color, and a mock battle that left the Europeans trembling. He wanted them to know that while they might have fire sticks, he had a human machine that could overwhelm them before they could reload. However, Shaka was fascinated by their technology. He sat with Finn for hours, questioning him about British medicine, the power of King George, and the nature of their weapons. In a famous exchange, Shaka watched a demonstration of a musket. He laughed at its inaccuracy and the time it took to load. He told the British, "By the time you have put your powder in the hole, my warriors will have run 100 yards and put a spear through your heart." He was right. At that time, the smoothbore musket was no match for a Zulu charge at close quarters. But Shaka also saw the value of British medicine. When he was wounded in an assassination attempt by a rival tribe, Henry Finn treated his wound with ointments and bandages. Shaka's recovery convinced him that the British were spirit doctors who could be useful allies. He granted the British land at Port Natal, effectively creating the first European settlement in his territory. It was a calculated move. Shaka believed he was using the British as a buffer and a source of intelligence. He even sent a diplomatic mission to Cape Town to open official relations with King George. He saw himself as an equal to the British monarch, two great kings ruling over two great empires. But Shaka's focus on the foreigners blinded him to the rot that was beginning to fester within his own family. Every man has a breaking point. For Shaka, that point was reached in October 1827. His mother, Nandi, the only person who had loved him when he was a bastard beetle, the only person he truly trusted, died of a stomach ailment. The grief that followed didn't just break Shaka's heart, it broke his mind. He had spent his life building an empire to prove his worth to her. Without her, the empire was a hollow shell. The mourning for Nandi became one of the darkest chapters in human history. Shaka descended into a state of great madness. He decreed that no crops were to be planted for a year. No milk, the staple of the Zulu diet, could be consumed. It was to be poured onto the ground. Any woman found pregnant was to be executed, along with her husband. He argued that if his mother was dead, no one else should experience the joy of life. But the horror didn't stop at decrees. At Nandi's funeral, Shaka stood among his people and watched. If he saw someone who wasn't crying hard enough, or someone he suspected was secretly glad she was gone, he signaled his execution. By the end of the funeral, it is estimated that 7,000 Zulu people had been slaughtered by their Yun king for the crime of insufficient grief. The protector of the nation had become its greatest predator. The soldiers who had followed him into the jaws of death at Gukokli Hill now looked at him with a new kind of fear, a fear that kills loyalty. Shaka's half-brothers, Dingane and Mulangana, saw the madness as a death sentence for the Zulu nation. They saw an empire exhausted by endless war and a king who had lost his moral compass. They began to whisper in the dark. They found an ally in Shaka's personal servant, Mbopa, who had grown weary of the king's erratic cruelty. Shaka was warned. His seers told him that the vultures were circling, but Shaka, perhaps wanting an end to his own grief, ignored them. He continued to send his armies on long, pointless campaigns to the north, leaving himself vulnerable and unprotected at his smaller kraal in Kwadukuza. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the bastard who had conquered the world was beyond the reach of mortal men. He was wrong. The stage was set for the final act of a tragedy that would echo through the centuries. By September 1828, the air around Shaka felt heavy, as if the ancestors themselves had withdrawn their protection. The king was a shadow of the man who had charged barefoot into the thorns of the Mthethwa. His eyes, once sharp enough to spot a spear tip in the tall grass at a mile, were now clouded by the memory of his mother. He had become a man who lived in the past, seemingly indifferent to the daggers being sharpened in the present. His half-brothers, Dingane and Mulangana, had watched Shaka's madness from the sidelines, waiting for the moment his guard dropped. That moment was now. They had successfully subverted Mbopa, the king's most trusted personal attendant. Mbopa was the key. He was the only man who could stand behind the king without being questioned. On the morning of September the 22nd, Shaka sat on a large rock outside his kraal, watching his cattle. He was distracted, perhaps pondering the British sea strangers or the legacy of the mother he could not let go of. He did not hear the soft footsteps on the dust behind him. The attack was swift and cowardly. Mbopa struck first, distracting the king with a sudden outburst or a feigned threat. In the confusion, Dingane and Mulangana lunged forward. They didn't use the long throwing spears of the old days. They used the Iklwa, the short, heavy-bladed stabbing spear that Shaka had forced them to master. The irony was poetic and bloody. The architect of the Zulu war machine was being dismantled by his own design. Shaka was stabbed multiple times. He fell from the rock, his blood soaking into the African soil he had spent a lifetime conquering. But legend says that as he lay in the dirt, he didn't scream for mercy. He didn't curse his brothers for their betrayal. Instead, he looked up at them with a terrifying, knowing smile. He saw beyond the blood on their hands. He saw the future he had paved, and the one they were too weak to prevent. With his final breaths, Shaka uttered a prophecy that would haunt the Zulu people for a century. He looked at Dingane and said, "You think you will rule this land? You think you have won? No. I see the swallows coming from the sea. They will build their houses of stone, and they will rule you like cattle." To the Zulu, The swallows were the white men, whose ships resembled the birds dipping into the water. Shaka knew that without his singular iron will, the empire he had built would be a feast for the colonial powers already gathering at the gates. Shaka's body was thrown into a grain pit and covered with stones. There was no royal funeral, no year of mourning. His brothers hoped that by burying the man, they could bury the memory. But Shaka Zulu was not a man. He was an idea, and ideas do not stay in pits. Dingane took the throne, but he lacked Shaka's genius and his terrifying discipline. The Zulu army remained a formidable force, but the soul of the machine had been ripped out. The swallows arrived exactly as Shaka had predicted. Within 10 years of his death, the Boers moved into the interior, leading to the bloody Battle of Blood River. 40 years after that, the British Empire, the most powerful force on earth, invaded Zululand. At the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, the British were humiliated by a Zulu army still using Shaka's buffalo horns formation. It was the greatest defeat a modern army had ever suffered at the hands of a non-industrialized nation. Shaka was dead, but his ghost was still winning battles. How do we judge a man like Shaka? To the Western world of the 19th century, he was a savage or a black Napoleon. To the tribes he destroyed during the Mfecane, he was a monster whose name is still spoken with a shudder. But to the Zulu people today, he is the father of the nation. He took a handful of shepherds and turned them into a name that commands respect on every corner of the globe. He was a man of contradictions, a visionary who saw the future, and a tyrant who was consumed by the past. He was an innovator who redefined warfare and a victim of the very violence he championed. Shaka Zulu remains the most famous African who ever lived, not because he was kind, but because he was undeniable. He proved that even in a world of sea strangers and lightning sticks, a man with a vision and a spear can change the course of history forever. The shadow of the spear still falls across Africa, and as long as the Zulu people stand tall, the name of Shaka will never truly be silent. Shaka Zulu was just the beginning. The history you were taught in school was only a fraction of the truth. There are empires lost to the sands of time, warriors whose names have been scrubbed from the records, and civilizations that achieve the impossible, only to vanish. In our next episode, we're heading west. We're going deep into the heart of the Benin Empire, a civilization that built a wall longer than the Great Wall of China and created art so advanced it baffled the world's greatest scientists. If you want to uncover the history they never wanted you to know, don't let this be the last story you hear. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Join our community of modern explorers, so you never miss a chapter of the greatest story ever told, the story of us.